Hey guys, Paul here. Slightly different filming location today. I'm visiting some relatives out of town, but same great Yu-Gi-Oh! Analysis. Today we're going to be talking about consistency in Yu-Gi-Oh! How much is too much? How far has it come? What's going on with consistency? So, I think the best place to start with this is, of course, what is consistency exactly in Yu-Gi-Oh! And I think most people know this, but I'm just kind of trying to lay a groundwork here. Basically, the idea that a deck can get the cards it needs quickly and reliably. So you're running usually a 40 card deck. It could be as many as 60 cards, and you can only run up to 3 copies of a single given card. But oftentimes decks will have an ideal monster that they want to see to start their plays, right? You might want to see Soul Eating Overraptor in your dinosaur deck, Alistair the Invoker in an invoked deck, or Snake Eye Ash in a Snake Eye deck. And so, if you can only run 3 copies of the card, then are there any other ways that you can see a card that you want at a given time? That's usually where maybe your Rota type cards come in, right? You've got your Fossil Dig, or you've got maybe a field spell like Magical Meltdown, or in Snake Eye's case, about a dozen other cards that can technically get to Snake Eye Ash. But yeah, basically, consistency is just that idea that, like, how can I kind of math it out and maximize my chances of seeing the best possible cards on the first turn? Because it's important, right? You and your opponent are both just drawing like 5 cards at the start, and there's not really any way to manipulate your opening hand, like what exactly that will be. So the next best thing is, okay, how can I manipulate my deck such that I have the best chance of drawing the cards that I need and, getting my strategy going before my opponent gets their strategy going. Nothing is more frustrating than bricking in Yu-Gi-Oh! And like losing because you just did not draw a playable card. In modern Yu-Gi-Oh! In particular, we oftentimes kind of just describe like starter cards in terms of the number that you get to run. Because effectively, if you're running, say, 3 Overraptor, but then also 3 Fossil Dig, then you're technically kind of running like 6 copies of Soul Eating Overraptor. And the same goes for a lot of different decks. Again, in the Snake Eye example, you could argue that you're running like a dozen copies of Snake Eye Ash or something like that. But the reason why I want to talk about this today was kind of because of Snake Eye, and I get it. I'm tired of talking about this stupid deck too. I hope we get a ban list soon, and it just kind of, we don't have to remember this nightmare. But really, Yu-Gi-Oh! These days in general has a lot of consistency to it. A lot of archetypes are given both a kind of starter monster that searches for other key monsters or spells and traps, as well as usually a spell or trap that can search for that monster or other similar related things. And then typically there's some off-engine thing that can also do the same. So, like, an example that I can just randomly give here is Drytron. That kind of came to mind for me. So the Drytron monsters are already pretty good self-starter cards. They need maybe another like Drytron monster to tribute, or like a fusion or ritual, or not fusion or ritual or ritual spell to like show for their effect. But basically, you just need to like see a Drytron monster in some form or fashion, and that usually lets you get going. The Drytron deck has a lot of consistency built into it, actually. There's Drytron Nova, which is kind of like an emergency teleport to just get your Drytron monster straight from the deck. Then you've got Drytron Fafnir to search for something like that, like Drytron Nova. And then you've even got Cyber Emergency, which is an off-theme card, like it's sort of for Cyber Dragons, but it searches light machines that can't be normal or special summoned or whatever. So, like, yeah, you get where it's going. You basically have like 9 different ways to get to a Drytron card. So Drytron is an incredibly consistent deck. And I want to be clear, I don't think that like a deck being consistent is like necessarily a bad thing, right? I mean, everybody wants to play Yu-Gi-Oh! And like losing to RNG sucks, so you would want your deck to be as consistent as you possibly can have it. But I do think that the main problem kind of comes in where it's like some decks are just so much more consistent than others that it can feel a little bit unfair. And what I'd like to know really is, where we all stand on this and like how much consistency is too much consistency. And what are maybe some of the negative externalities of Yu-Gi-Oh being this consistent game that it is. There's a big one, obviously, that I think everybody can kind of guess that I'll get to in a second. But I think that the best place to look for this, really, like to look next in this whole consistency conversation, is like, what do the lower tier decks have to work with when it comes to consistency? Like, obviously you can talk about top tier decks all the time that have like loads of ways to get what they want. Even if we're not talking Snake Eye, you can think of like Kashtira, Tearlament, stuff like that. Like they've never had an issue with getting their cards. But what if, I take a deck like Exo Sisters, right? It's a little bit more middling, and technically it's got consistency cards. It has like Exo Sister packs. But outside of that, there's actually not like another way to get like another Exo Sister monster to your hand. You could argue that something like Exo Sister Martha is kind of there as well. So, she is a starter card in and of herself. but you're not like working with as much as say maybe Drytron or Snake Eye is. And then conversely, there's something like Evil Twins. They kind of hit the middle of the road too. They have like two different spells that can get them the things they want. Plus, technically, you can also run like Silent Mining. And so like they've got a lot too. There's like mid-range decks that have a lot of stuff. I think it's when you look at the really, really, really low tiers. Like I remember when I was playing, I was building Dual Avatar for fun, for instance, and that deck just like did not really have much of anything. Or I was playing Gunkin Su Ships one time, and I realized that they also don't really seem to have like a reliable way to search outside of like the one field spell. And so, effectively, I think it's mostly unfair when like a deck has a dozen ways to start versus another deck having maybe like three rotas in their deck that can kind of get them going. And how could you maybe balance stuff like that? So something that I kind of have been thinking about is I don't mind if a deck isn't super consistent as long as there's like a reliable consistency card and then like a not as reliable consistency thing. So for instance, for me, like that might be in Vanquish Souls. In Vanquish Soul, I have Raisin's like the starter card. Raisin. I think it's Rosin actually. Yeah, Rosin's like the starter card, and I can run a single copy of Rhoda. Most people don't even count Rhoda because it's at one. But outside of that, I have to run a lot of suboptimal ways of getting to another copy of it. So like I could run Small World, that's pretty common in Vanquish Soul builds. You can run Infernoble, what is it, Durandal, that like searches. That's slightly less optimal too, because like you need to either be going second or have a thing that can like special summon itself to equip it with. And so like it's not optimal, right? There's even Stake Your Soul, but again, that requires another fire monster in your hand if you want to get rosin with it. So it's like a cool kind of diverse or flexible like e-telly type card, but it's not optimal. For me personally, this is kind of where I like consistency to be for decks. I don't really care for like decks that just have like 9 spells searching everything that they want or whatever, or like monsters that can all kind of converge in on the same like playmaking card. It's kind of where the Fiendsmith engine that it's sort of feeling like that it gets into that territory. But it's more like I think that decks should not have perfect consistency. I think that they should just like players should have to kind of like sometimes work their way towards getting an ideal solution. So like in the case of Small World is a good search card if your deck can like manage it and you have the right kind of type and attribute combos and stuff to get to it. But it's also like a neg 1 in card economy. Not a huge deal, but that sort of thing does add up. Same with like the Durandal thing where like you have to be going second. And maybe this is kind of the Yugi boomer in me where I want the power level to like be a little bit lower. But I think that, adding a few more stipulations to search spells is not a bad thing. So also the thing that I wanted to talk about where like I feel there's a downside to decks being hyper consistent is the more consistency that a deck has, like where there's just a lot of ways to see the starter card, typically the like more hand traps and stuff that they're able to run. I don't know how to I guess describe it perfectly, but basically if you're running like I think of maybe the Invoked deck from several years back now. God, it feels weird to think about how old Invoked really is. Back when there were 3 terraformings and then 3 magical meltdowns, you could say that you're running 9 Alistairs. And Alistairs are honestly already like kind of a self-sufficient card. And so really you could run just that little 9-card Alistair suite and a bunch of hand traps. And that's kind of where you get into that territory that a lot of people don't really like about modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Where like a deck's engine can be so like lean and consistent that all you have to really do is just fill the rest of your deck up with hand traps to stop anything that the opponent does. And now you've got this very like min-maxed just deck that's kind of boringly effective and also boringly defensive against the opponent. And I don't want to say that that's like outright a bad thing. Like that's just kind of Yu-Gi-Oh! Taken to its next logical conclusion. Like you want the best cards and the best chances to see those cards. There's a reason why people have deck building calculators. Like that's kind of part of the fun of deck building. But I just sometimes think it would be nice if maybe like we had to kind of rely on slightly slower, more awkward methods of searching. Something that I remember like way back in, I guess it could kind of count as like Edison days, is playing Gladiator Beasts, and Gladiator Beasts had Gladiator Proving Ground, which sort of functioned as their Rhoda. Great, you can just search any Gladiator Beast you want. But there are also cards like Gladiator Beast Respite, which was not actually formally like a search card, it was just a draw card. And so if you bricked with a couple of, Gladiator Beast, War Chariot or things like that in your hand that you want to shuffle back in, you could, and you get to draw 3, so there's a pretty good chance you'll see something that you want, but it's not guaranteed, so there's a little bit more risk involved in it. Sort of similar to the Vanquish Soul example I made. I'm not sure that like I have the best opinion on this really. Like I still feel like I'm maybe just being fueled by this idea that like I want decks to be a little weaker in general and games to go a little longer in general. So that's where I kind of want to hear from you guys. What do you think? Like, do you feel that consistency being like as high as it kind of is in today's Yu-Gi-Oh is a good thing, or would you say that maybe we could like dial it back a little bit? But would there be like problems with decks being bricky and inconsistent? Would it actually make games just feel sackier? I'm not really sure, but that's where I want to hear from you guys, like I said. So let me know down in the comments how consistent is too consistent, and how should consistency like be designed into Yu-Gi-Oh. And one last thing too is, how do you feel about when off archetype cards still like work in an archetype? Like say Drytron using Cyber Emergency, I think is an inoffensive example now, but like at the time that technically made Drytron like even more of a threat than it already is when it was like a tier 1 deck. So, thinking about it that way, is that like a good or a bad thing too? And maybe even what you think of things like Fiendsmith, where like any 2 cards can kind of just become, what is it, like the Moon Maiden, Night Lady, whatever, and then turn into the Fiendsmith engine. Kind of reminds me of like, what was it? Nightmare Mermaid and the full Orcust combo from any 2 monsters. Yeah, I mean, that's a different video on its own. All right, I've gone on long enough. You guys can let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next one. Fast turn.